Couple of quick notes on the orchestration, a pretty standard maximalist style 20th century orchestra. Bartok also calls for an extended brass section of 4 trumpets in C with 4 alto trombones, and, if it wasn't loud enough, an organ. A quick note on overall range and register in this excerpt. Throughout the excerpt, in fact the entire work really, Bartok is always at the extremities of range, even within each section. His orchestration is infinitely colourful, allowing him to voice his thematic material with constant variety. Though much of the excerpt is incidental music, the ranges of the instruments mostly sound around the voice when it is scored. The excerpt commences with a moment of quasi-secco recitative in a tone cluster with the celli and violas sounding a closed voicing of D minor triad on a tremolo. The pitches are doubled on stopped horns and muted trumpets in an overlapped yet juxtaposed voicing, with the trumpets doubling the A natural and the B flat at the top of the chord. The B flat begins to form a tone cluster that clashes with the D minor's statement of tonal and timbral stability in the warm and ambiguous registers of the lower strings. Ambiguous in the sense of that they could be either or, double basses, celli, or violas, with regards to their voicing. The horns and trumpets also contribute to the ambiguous effect, blurring lines between which instrument is which, with the stopping and the muting respectively. However, careful distinctions can be made as the trumpets double the upper voices of the cluster in the first beat. The cluster is also enriched by the clarinets artois sounding on the first beat of the bar a tremolo between concert C and D. The sense of cluster creates a wash of ambiguity and uncertainty in the orchestration. It is subtly enriched by the clarinets shifting their tremolo to E flat and D in a more present and raspy register on the second beat, with a doubling up the octave of the previously sounded A B flat brass cluster in the flutes 3 and 4 and oboes. This is then doubled again up the octave by flutes 1 and 2, not the piccolos, for a shrill effect, marked 8VA. All this preparation by Bartok allows the voice in bar 9 of 72 to sound in between all of the sonorities across the ensemble. The soprano voice sits between F at the top of the stave and down to an A in the middle, whereas the sonorities sounded stretch no lower than the A a third above the top of the stave in the winds, and the B flat just a semitone above the soprano's final note in the phrase. The overall effect here is a sectionally balanced juxtaposition of both a blend and clash of colours in the orchestration, created by various disagreements in the sonority and harmonics between the sections. The shrill register of the flutes 1 and 2 creates an eerie and unstable effect. This orchestration here enables the lyric voice to carry through the middle of the orchestration for maximum clarity of text and no interference with the overall timbral impression of the voice. The brief Agitato section leads the scene into the penultimate section before the fifth door. Bartok brings his iconic quartal and secondal harmonies to life in this section through the orchestration, whilst painting the theme of the text simultaneously. The main theme appears in the violins 1 and 2 tutti, doubled by the flutes 1 and 2. It dominates the thematic material, note Bartok's harmonic preferences, a descending minor second followed by a descending fourth, with a strong presence created by the doublings. For contrast, a less dominant counter melody occurs over 3 octaves below in the bassoon 3, contrabassoon and lower strings, immediately framing the range of this brief section and contributing to a final sonic peak prior to the following section. For added contrast, bar 2 of 73 sees an adaptation of the violin 1 theme in the viola part, doubled by horns 1 and 3. This provides more interest in the orchestral material and creates an echo effect underneath the baritone's final phrase. This reserved restatement on the violas and horns does not interfere with the sung phrase in sonority and blends with the rest of the ensemble by the doubling of the 2 warmest instruments in their respective sections. This is a subtle element that Bartok uses sparingly in this section of the work, focusing on the voicings for his overall effect, which leads us to Voicings. Here is a reduction of Bartok's voicings from 73 bar 5 through to the end of the excerpt, selected bars only. The 6 separate bars exemplify how Bartok introduces and treats his section through the remainder of the excerpt, climaxing into the monumental sonic explosion of the opening of the fifth door. Firstly, Bartok rebuilds his ensemble again in simple juxtaposition in the winds and the strings, all marked piano. The baritone voice part sits below the entire ensemble, affording it strength and avoiding interference from the other parts of the orchestra. The rebuilding from scratch effect is achieved noticeably with a familiar voicing in all parts. By the time we reach bar 13 of 73 with a constant ascending harmonic progression in all parts, Bartok introduces new instruments and voicings radically different to the simple juxtaposition. Flutes 1 to 3 dominate the top register of the ensemble, along with violin 1 and 2, both divisi groups 1, while the ensemble generally supports this steady progression. Within the winds, we hear the enclosure of the clarinets 1 to 3 by the oboes 1 and 2, balanced only by a horn 1 at the bottom of the chord cluster. In the strings, we hear overlapping by celli and violas, creating a tonally warm and ambiguous effect. In the penultimate bar to the fifth door, the orchestration builds to the great climax. Bartok includes all upper winds and upper strings, flutes, oboes, clarinets, violas, violins, for the rising phrase to the cadence. This occurs over 2 octaves, with the flutes doubling up the octave A2 above the stave. The bassoons are voiced in closed juxtaposition in the middle register to add weight and strength to the winds, as well as the trumpets and trombones. However, to create a strong sense of cluster and a washy, warm, and ambiguous effect, Bartok voices the lower strings in an interlocking fashion. Overall, the stability in the middle of the orchestra's register by the simple juxtaposed voicing in the lower winds and all the brass allows for great variety at the ensemble's registral extremes, with a variety of voicings implemented in the strings and the high winds. Finally, the climax. Percussion, strings and winds are marked fortissimo and strings fortissimo, and we include the organ marked organo pleno, meaning to remove all the stops and let her rip. The reduction of the voices here displays a strong emphasis on the third of the triad and the lower fourth in the lower instruments, with the entire ensemble moving in parallel intervals through the most extremely effective and strong registers of the individual instruments. The effect is monumental and sonically extreme, submitting the audience perhaps to the most resonant and large an orchestra can sound of this size, perhaps almost matching the magnitude of Richard Strauss with a total of 105 players. The final section also sees the addition of the cor anglais, but I bet you won't hear it. Thank you for your attention, and whatever you do, do not open the 7th door. There's no going back.
Thank you.